I'm the advocacy director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm also a journalist and researcher and worked in the Middle East as a journalist and did my doctoral research in Egypt, worked in Dubai and Lebanon, and for the New York Times in Washington. And at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we have actually focused this year a lot on the issue of sexual violence and trying to take advantage of the fact that this year the Commission on the Status of Women, for the first time in 15 years, focused on women in the media. And I think with the Me Too movement and a lot of the attention that came after the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, the issue of sexual violence as a silencing tool against women journalists and what they have to go through, how they combat it, how they continue to do their work equally, if not oftentimes better than male colleagues, is something that we really wanted to focus on here, because we can't talk about independent journalism, pluralistic media, without recognizing that ensuring women's ability to be journalists and to work safely is critical. I'm also a member of the ACOS board, and the ACOS stands for a culture of safety. The ACOS Alliance is really unprecedented alliance between many major news organizations, including all of the major wires in the world, as well as Press Freedom Organization and freelance journalists. And the idea being that we have to do more to create a culture of safety in the newsroom. And this really came out of the conflict in Syria and seeing what was happening there, but realizing that we need to do more for journalists, freelancers, fixers, et cetera, and that this also has to include gender. When we think about creating a culture of safety, we have to include consideration of women journalists. So I want to start by introducing an incredible panel that I'm so delighted to be joined here with today. So starting on my left, Rosa is a staff reporter for the foreign desk at Mundo. Tracie is the founder of All Digitocracy. Anna is an independent journalist who covers war and conflict, and Lina is the editor-in-chief of Mada Masr. And what we're going to do this morning is have a conversation about these issues, and I want to invite you, if you have something to add, a question, or even your own perspective. I don't want us to talk at you. I want this to be a conversation. So feel free to raise your hand, and if I can integrate you into the conversation, I will. So as we kick off this discussion, I want to start with Rosa, who is, as I mentioned, the staff reporter at the foreign desk for Mundo and has been focused on the protection and security of journalists in hostile environments, and also on trying to bring more visibility to women journalists. So when we were preparing for this panel, we were talking about some of the things that journalists do to prepare to go into conflict zones, training, working with their editors, and you said that there doesn't seem to be enough focus on the specific types of threats that women might face. So can you tell us more about what you saw and what you're doing about it?
Well, yeah.
So take the microphone. Yeah.
In my experience, I cover conflicts like Lebanon, like Libya, and Syria, and in my experience I realized that I didn't have a training, and this is something in Spanish media is not very common to train their journalists on hostile environments. So I felt the need to encourage newsrooms and to encourage journalists to take this kind of training, and also just to think about their security on hostile environments. Well, this is valid for war correspondents, for special envoys, but I think it's also very important for local journalists who are working on conflict zones every day and they live there. So I don't think it's only about foreign journalists. So my compromise started with my own experience. I was covering the Libya war, and while I was in Misrata 2011, I got shot. I survived because some colleagues from Channel 4 UK, I have always to thank them for that, they borrowed me their flak jacket because they realized their security expertise that my equipment was not good for that kind of conflict. I was having a flak jacket with no plates. For when you are in a war zone, you need level 4 plates in your jacket. So they borrowed me this equipment, and that's why I survived. Then I realized that I had to demand to my newsroom, and I had to raise a voice in Spanish media and try to talk with my colleagues for them to be aware that they need protection, they need training on security, they need how to know to protect themselves and to be prepared for this kind of places. So, well, more or less, this is my
So you said, I remember you said that you went back to your newsroom and said, hey, we need the right equipment, and this was not the right flak jacket, and you got some pushback.
Yeah, I went at the end, my newspaper realized that they had to do something with that, and it was a very good result. But at the beginning, because they didn't know and they didn't have any information, I mean, most of the editors in general, in media in general, they didn't cover this kind of conflicts, so they don't know, they can't imagine. So I tried to make a lot of meetings with all the bosses to make sure that, to convince them that we need to do this kind of courses. And there is some of a believing that this is a man job, and that's why, because we went to military service, we don't need a training because I am very macho man. So some people is they don't believe in this kind of things, so you have to convince them. And
did you get training for conflict training before you went to Libya?
Still, I came back to Libya twice in the middle of the war, and I didn't have the training because it was negotiations and searching for a training course was ongoing. But I did took equipment, a flak jacket, properly, but the training came later.
And yeah. The training that you got, did it include any consideration of gender or sexualized violence in what we call the HEFAT training?
Yeah, that was another thing that I wanted to point out, that trainings are very, very good, but some of them are not very aware of sexual violence, are not very aware of this specific issue. And I think they should be, some of them are very good, but I think they should take this more in consideration. My training, because we were 2 women on it, me and one freelance colleague, we asked for specific formation on the issue, but it wasn't prepared in the program, but they gave us a lot of tips and a lot of things. Still, I think we have to do a lot to make people aware of that.
And Anna, you, so it's hard enough apparently when you're a staff journalist to get appropriate training. What about as a freelancer? You cover conflict, you worked in the Middle East, in Iraq, and what kind of training have you had? What was offered? How were you able to get it? And did it include any consideration of gender or sexualized violence?
I'm really lucky that I've been coming into myself as a journalist in this age where there is a lot more attention towards freelancers and organizations like Lekas, which you were talking about, and also Frontline Freelance Registrar. and Roypack Trust and all these places that take into account the risks that we take as freelance journalists and do organized trainings that are then, affordable and stuff for us. And I've been part of organizing these trainings as well because I see the enormous need among my colleagues who are doing really dangerous and crazy things without ever having had a first aid class and stuff, and that's terrifying. So I've been really lucky to attend one of these. There was a bit of a gender component, which went over some, tips like wearing a one-piece bathing suit when you're covering a rally to avoid sexual assault, turning your belt inside out, basically, making yourself less accessible to perpetrators. But it kind of stopped here, and I think the training is on its way. There needs to be a lot more conversation about it, obviously, but the place that I would really like to see more of is support within news organizations and within peer support networks as well, which as freelancers, once again, we rely on, because often when our jobs are very precarious, all we have is each other at the end of the day. So we really have to have each other's backs.
So you mentioned that one of the things before you go out into the field, when you've worked for different organizations like Vice and other organizations, that you need to do a security assessment. Tell us about that process and to what extent are considerations of sexual assault or online harassment included in those assessments?
So it's always a smart idea to do a risk assessment before you're doing something like this, but often that only happens when you're going on assignment, which is already, approved by somebody, and sometimes, places will buy stuff from conflict reporters who have already just gone and done something, which is also dangerous and maybe another conversation. But when I have done these risk assessments, it's often very focused around the risks that we associate with journalists, stuff like injury from incoming fire or kidnapping or, even various other personal safety risks like car accidents. And I have rarely seen sexual assault integrated into these I think there's a variety of reasons for it. For myself personally, it actually, until I talked to Courtney about it yesterday, it hadn't crossed my mind to even put sexual assault as a risk, which, of course I face with every story. And I found that really troubling, and that spoke a lot to the environment that we're facing, where we're trying so hard as female conflict reporters in still a pretty male-dominated realm to appear tough, that just putting this very obvious vulnerability down on paper, we're afraid of losing a job, we're afraid of someone thinking we don't have what it takes, and I would really like to see that pressure to be tough broken down and challenged, and us to put down this risk and take care of it and talk about supporting survivors and what to do in case that happens, the same way that we do about kidnapping and injury and things like this.
And I think that's one thing we're going to take back to the ACOS Alliance and the Gender Working Group, is thinking about, again, how do you integrate this into standard sets of practices that already exist out there, because we see that they're not really integrated into that. So we also have here with us two media entrepreneurs who lead in the newsrooms and who have Lina as the editor-in-chief, Tracie is founder of Digitocracy. So they have had responsibility for newsrooms, for reporters, et cetera. And what both of these women also bring is a consideration around the intersectionality of gender, race, sexual orientation, and on how all of these also fit together. So I want to turn to Lina, who, again, runs a website in Cairo, and many of us know that in 2011, with several violent sexual assaults on women journalists who were covering the uprisings, including CPJ's board member Lara Logan, there was a lot of attention globally to this, and it also brought a lot of attention in Egypt. And I want to ask you about your experience, both as a journalist, but also as an editor in a newsroom with responsibility, and especially in a newsroom where you've said you are really trying to achieve gender parity. How does this sort of training, capacity building, putting this on the agenda figure into your newsroom?
Well, my experience started really with making sure that there is something that transcends gender balance in the newsroom, in the sense that it's not as simple as even making it a 50-50, you know, because we really live in a male-dominated society, you need to actually transcend this like 50-50 logic, and it needs to be more than that. So, you know, what I've been very conscious of is creating that balance, the, you know, over 50-50 balance in the different newsrooms I managed. And also because I always saw how this pays off in terms of activating a gender lens in everything we're covering. So again, thinking of gender in an intersectional way, in a way that permeates the different things that we're covering, including hard politics, including, you know, big mobilizations, big protests, and so on. And it is something that, you know, at the risk of sounding essentialist, can only happen if you have, you know, gender diversity in your newsroom. Now, in terms of safety, I also belong to the generation of journalists who, you know, back from the times from before the revolution, and when in 2005, for example, while we were covering a major referendum in Egypt, police basically abruptly deployed its troops on female journalists and sexually molested them in order to basically prevent us from covering the violations that were happening during that polling process. And I remember it was a moment where I had major doubts about being able to continue doing journalism in this country. And it's actually, it was so hard that I had to leave for a little bit and then come back to start this long process of managing different newsrooms. And, you know, if anything, it did not necessarily encourage me to think proactively into, you know, what exactly, what are forms of safety and what are resources I should deploy in the newsrooms to protect female journalists, but how to make sure rather that there are always female journalists who are not inhibited by what happens, particularly the use of sexual violence as a political tool to sideline them from the ability to do their work. So how to make sure to fight this by constantly finding women and, you know, including them in the newsroom. The one thing I'll say is that what was also fascinating in 2011 was the beginning of the Arab uprisings and all that, and was the growth of the newsroom I was managing back then, and then Mada, Masr, which I was managing now. It was always interesting to see that there were always more female journalists who are willing to actually take more risks and, you know, to go out there and cover, especially at dire moments where, you know, the problem was not only with sexual violence, it was just basically with police violence, that doesn't differentiate between men or women or anything. So the idea was always to try to capitalize on that energy and to basically encourage it, whereas in other environments it's just basically stifled a lot of the times. But I can move on and talk a bit about thinking of in-house sexual harassment policy, but let's leave that for later questions.
Yeah, we're going to definitely talk about sexual harassment, but before we move on to that, can you talk about, you know, given that we know that protests in Egypt are dangerous places for women, I think the only place I've ever been sexually assaulted as a reporter was in Egypt covering a protest. What specific steps do you take to make sure that your staff is prepared for that?
Yeah, in 2011, for example, when we started seeing reports that there are sexual mobs around women journalists and else, and of course it was made very visible with the case of Lara Logan, we started being much more rigorous about the policy of not sending individuals to cover the protests, but sending people in teams. They don't have to be teams of men and women. I tried to resist that for the longest time, but, you know, people will have to go to the field in twos and in threes. And again, being a newsroom and an institution helps, you know, and this is where I have a lot of empathy for freelancers who, you know, have to end up doing the job on their own. So I would capitalize on the fact that we are a newsroom and we do that. The other thing that we're doing more proactively right now is providing mental health support. post incidents, and that's also not specific to sexual assault. That's in general when you go and are exposed to traumatic events, traumatic violence, and we can see in the newsroom, and I'm very sensitive to these things, symptoms of unwellness. This is when we start making actions, suggesting different things that can be done, like seeing someone or organizing a meeting, or basically mental health support. So those are the two broad things, or the two broad types of interventions that I would engage in to support journalists.
So, in addition to the physical violence, online violence is a very real threat to women journalists of all persuasions, but women journalists see it a lot, and many studies that have been done show that there is a preponderance of online violence directed at women journalists, and that when women journalists are attacked online, there's often a gendered element to that. And I hope that everyone in this room recognizes that there's no such thing as the online life that is somehow separate from your offline life. As journalists, we all live and work in both spaces, and so they are not separable. And we know that online violence can have profound effects on the ability of women journalists to remain in journalists, to do their jobs, and it is a very real element that journalists have to deal with. So I want to turn now to Tracie, who, as I mentioned, runs Digitocracy, and became, your website became a target of hackers. You have received rape threats online, which sadly many women journalists have faced, and you have had to deal with, and you also work with colleagues that you can share some stories about how the online threats have had very real consequences.
Right. Yes, thank you. So I think it's important to know that you don't have to be in a conflict zone in order to receive these kinds of threats and harassment. You can just be in the midst of covering your beat, and especially if you cover race, you become a target. People, for some reason, feel like that gives them license to email you, to threaten rape, to find out where you live, to call your doctor or to call your vet and try to get your records, to post your personal information online. I've been fortunate that my audience is pretty global, but I have colleagues who work in local newsrooms and are in relatively close proximity to the people who have threatened them. This is not a new phenomenon. When I started out as a young reporter, I remember I was covering city government, and I had a city official invite me to go coon hunting. How many people in this room know what coon hunting is? I didn't know either. I was very naive. And so I was excited because I thought I was building a relationship with a source. And I went back to my newsroom and told my editor, hey, what do I take with me on this coon hunting trip? And he just stopped. He froze and he looked at me and he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, so-and-so invited me to go coon hunting. And all of a sudden, he just banged his fist against his desk and he ran out. By the time he got back, he brought me into the office and he told me that was a direct threat. They used to take black people out into the countryside and lynch them. Blacks were referred to as coons, and that was what that was. I had no idea. And so I remember him just taking me aside and asking me if I was okay after he explained all of this to me. I think that now that we have the digital era, people feel more comfortable because a lot of it is anonymous. But I mean, I can talk a little bit about some, because I've become an advocate for journalists. I now get calls from journalists. Michelle Ferrier is one. She was a columnist for her newspaper, again in the South, and a man continuously emailed her and sent her letters threatening rape. She had to leave her home and check into a hotel for safety reasons. Wendy Thomas is another reporter just writing about race, and she was threatened with rape. She actually sent me copies of the emails, and when they went to their bosses, their editors, the response was, just ignore it. You have to have a thick skin. So, you know, that's where we are. I think the issues are getting a little bit more attention, but when you talk about race specifically, a lot of times when you talk about sexual violence, it leaves out that, the element of race, and you can't talk about that without discussing race and talking about how they kind of parallel or intersect with one another. And how do you think that, because you said, you know, there's been more attention to this, and I think that's true. We've seen, you know, UN agencies and the OSCE and, you know, lots of conferences talking about online harassment. But do you think that newsrooms are providing the right resources and enough support to women journalists on how to deal with online harassment and how to deal with the repercussions and the trauma that's created by that? Some newsrooms in the U.S. have drafted guidelines to help women know what steps they should take when this happens, but not nearly enough. I have noticed that more people have been talking about it at conferences, journalism conferences, but I don't know that it is a routine part of training in most newsrooms in the States. And Anna, we were talking about online harassment yesterday as basically something that women journalists now accept as part of an inherent part of their job, and talking about the choices around whether to be visible on social media and to put the resources into cultivating, and as a freelancer that can be very important, but then also potentially making the choice not to be on social media so that you can avoid that harassment. Talk about some of the trade-offs there and what you consider and what you're considering in your career about, you know, deciding whether that's something you're going to have to deal with.
So like a lot of people right now, I've been thinking a lot about how I use social media, and from everything from data to harassment, et cetera, et cetera. And I've noticed, you know, there's some female journalists out there who are just like, you know, screw the trolls, I'm gonna do my thing, I'm gonna bite back at them, I'm gonna do everything, and I have respect for that on some level, but I see them burn out really, really quickly, and that has a huge toll on your mental health, and you know, makes you need to pull back, makes you kind of shut down, makes you burn out. And that's something I think that we need to take into account. And then you have kind of the opposite where, you know, something I'm kind of guilty of sometimes is I'm just like, you know, I'm just not even gonna look at this, I'm gonna enjoy the world, et cetera, which is great. But we're also, as freelancers, kind of these little mini businesses, so we really do need to be on social media. Like, I've grown my career because it's happened in the age of social media, and people can find me online and give me assignments and invite me to things, and it's great. It's this really powerful, amazing tool that's connecting all of us to each other. So for me personally, I've been trying to be more mindful of how I use certain social media platforms and who I engage with and who I don't. But it's still a conversation I'm having in my head and really hoping to have with you guys as well and a lot of other female journalists, because I think there's it's such an exciting tool that it's really easy to go overboard and then get overwhelmed, and you know, you don't, because also when you burn out, that's a form of silencing as well, because you just don't have the energy to do your work. And I've experienced that myself, and it's also detrimental to your career. So I think it's an important conversation.
Yeah, I recently experienced a case of self-censorship myself where CPJ, in response to President Trump's fake news awards, decided to give out our own awards looking at the press oppressors around the world. And we did give an honorable mention to President Trump for his global influence in the deterioration of press freedom. And many of the op-eds that responded to it and the comments that responded to it clearly had not read it. They just saw, you know, Trump was on the list with Duterte and Putin. And they didn't read the rationale, which is that the US has outsized global influence on the press freedom. And I was asked to write an op-ed, and I didn't want to because I knew that would bring out the trolls. And I was like, oh, this is what we're talking about, you know, the self-censorship that it causes. Rosa, I want to ask you, you know, in your newsroom, do they talk about this? Have you had any discussions about it? Is there capacity building for journalists to think about this?
I think there's a lot of work to do, particularly in Spain, on this issue, and also because we don't have a legal definition typifying, I don't know if this is the right word in English, of these threats, online threats and online harassment as a crime. We don't have this in our legal code. So I think this is a global problem that we need to, law needs to adapt to the times.
But even if there's no law, newsrooms can still support their staff. So I'm just asking, you know, in your newsroom, do you think that this is something that is sufficiently addressed? Do you think that editors and, you know, publishers, particularly in your newsroom, what's your experience?
Well, I have experience on not threats, but harassment online and personal attacks on what you, after publishing things. And of course, Tracy says very well that you don't need to be on a conflict zone to suffer this. But I think not only my newsroom, but in general, there's a lot of work to do because it's a problem that is now very, very coming up. It's something new. Journalists are talking about it. We are debating between us.
So you talk about it in the newsroom?
In newsroom, yes, we talk about it. And really we need, maybe we need to put it on paper, some guidelines on how to do if I have to respond or I have to ignore. So yes, I had some problems on deciding what to do. Well, I usually ignore it, but I don't think it's the right thing. And I have some colleagues that receive threats and they went to police because there was a very serious thing. And they have a unit on online security and things, so they help her. But I think we have to develop this issue.
Did you want to add?
Well, yeah, I think it's easy to say just block the person, but in my experience, that doesn't always work. Because what they do is they come in under another name, or they get their buddies. And again, if you write about race, particularly, and you have to use social media, that's where our audience is. Facebook, for example, they will get their communities to target you. So they all come in and they'll say really nasty things, start private messaging you. And then they also report your account so that Facebook will suspend your account. And that happens all the time. And that drives journalists, women in particular, off the platform. They won't use Facebook for that reason because Facebook does not recognize how its terms of service is being abused to silence that individual. But I think it's not just social media. It's just not blocking someone on social media. Just like you can stalk yourself online, you know, to find out what's out there, other people can stalk you too. And they can find out where you live. They can get your email address. They can, you know, call your relatives, your family members, and threaten them. These are real things that have happened to me and to others, simply because we want to do our jobs and write about our communities. So it's just not a simple act of, you know, of trying to block somebody, and that is usually the typical response from editors.
So Lina, Mada Masr has the dubious honor of being blocked in Egypt, one among more than 500 websites, if I recall correctly, which makes it all the more imperative that you use social media to get out there. How are you seeing the online violence against women journalists there? And to what extent, you know, in the Middle East, we know that there have also been state-sponsored or perhaps sanctioned attacks on journalists, especially women journalists, using these sexual tropes online. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The thing is that because our work is very political, and you know, and we think of gender, as I said before, in a very intersectional way, as in it is a lens that permeates the different kinds of coverage that we have. So we are not particularly, we're not more than others, for example, being the subject of threats addressed to women in particular, or women journalists in particular, but you would typically find a lot of trolling and violence in the comments made to pieces, for example, that we cover, or features or investigations that we do about the crackdown on the LGBTQ community, for example, in Egypt. And one of the things that we've discussed in how to deal with this increased publishing on social media, because as you said, Courtney, we've been having to resort to a more active use of social media recently, because the government has not blocked Facebook and Twitter, mostly for economic reasons, but they've been blocking our website, amongst others. What we've been quite conscious of is how to preserve our social media channels as safe spaces. So whereas I've never had a policy of deleting comments, but when comments, and these particularly come in response to some of our investigations, like I said before, on crackdown on people of different sexual orientation, on what's happening with the LGBTQ community, even a series that we've started about women's experiences with abortion, which is a widely rejected practice religiously and culturally in Egypt. So a lot of these comments would not just incite hate, but would actually incite violence against us, violence against the authors of these pieces, violence against, you know, the people behind a web media that they consider are here to just promote, you know, regressive thoughts, quote unquote. So we've come to terms with the fact, no, we have to start deleting some of these comments, actually, because it is very important for me that when someone, and this is not just thinking about us as the community of the producers of this content, but also when someone comes to read this content, they need to feel safe in it. They need to feel that this is a space where they can read, engage, make arguments, critically engage with the content without feeling that, you know, there will be also trolls responding to them and putting them down. And because on individual levels, we've been on, in different points in time, subjects to individualized harassment and online violence. You know, I myself experienced this throughout the 15 years where I worked as a journalist, on the back of not just me being a woman, but more importantly, me being, you know, opposed to the poles of power in the country. I know how much it can mentally bring you down. You know, there were moments of complete paralysis from the, you know, from the insanity of the comments and the private messaging and all that we would get. So the idea is, how do we transform these personal experiences into something that is also more communal? And when I think community, it's not just for the safety of us as a group of predominantly female journalists, but the wider us as a group of journalists working in the newsroom, and our readers and our loyal readers particularly.
So you mentioned the importance of, you know, us as journalists working in the newsroom, but we also know that sexual harassment is a challenge that has gained more visibility, and the issue of burnout and the personal challenge that has. And Anna, you were talking about, or if you can talk to the audience a bit about your experience with sexual harassment, both in terms of your sources, the people you need to interact with in order to do your job, and then also having to deal with that in your newsroom.
Yeah, so kind of like Tracy was saying, you don't have to be in a conflict zone to be running the risk of sexual harassment. And I ran into it even a couple weeks ago. I was reporting in a market in London. I was being super friendly with some people to interview them. And then one of them decides to take that as an invitation to grab my ass. So that happened in London. And then, so this can happen with anyone from a source that you're interviewing, from someone you're getting a visa from, to someone at a checkpoint. When I was living in Iraq, like what my TV crew I ran around with made fun of me, in good heart, but because I was the only woman that a lot of these soldiers at checkpoints were seeing for days. So they would let me through because they were delighted to see a female that, they thought had a sexy accent and stuff like that. And but this really got to me, and it meant that the organization I was working for actually wasn't getting me the permissions that I needed for the checkpoints, because they were basically relying on my feminine charm to get me through and get the product that we all needed collectively as a company. And then, not only this was happening, but also in the newsroom, so the editors would make a lot of comments about how I looked on camera and stuff like this. So I burned out so hard because I was getting it from everyone along the route that, actually the most exhausting part of my job wasn't the fact that I was covering Mosul. It was all of these men that were just like commenting on me left and right and making me not feel safe. So anyway, that's kind of my general experience. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Well, and then you might hope that you could come back into your newsroom and get a bit of reprieve from that, but I understand that's not quite what happened in your case.
Right, that wasn't what happened in my case, and then this was really before the Me Too conversation was happening, and I think if that had been happening during this time, some of my colleagues would have taken it more seriously when I just vented about it. And I think that sometimes, and sometimes people want to come up with a response, or they want to come up with a way to help, and they say something like, oh, that's just how they are, you're not going to change it, or something like that. Sometimes it actually really helps just to have someone say, oh, that really sucks, I'm sorry that happened to you. And not try to help, not try to fix, nothing. Just validate what you're saying. And I think that is the first step that some editors in some newsrooms can say, or even we can take as peer support networks for other freelancers, is just giving a space to, because I think part of what is sort of traumatizing about sexual assault is how people respond to it. And also what makes it a different threat that I face in the field than like kidnapping or injury or something like this is it's more pervasive because it comes with every story, and I don't just do conflict stories. So, and then also anticipating what comes after, because I feel like, I don't know, if you survive a kidnapping or an injury, you can be pretty sure that you'll get some kind of support afterwards from either peers or from your newsroom or anywhere. And with sexual assault, you're afraid to even talk about it because you might get the opposite of support. So even anticipating what could happen after the possible sexual assault kind of puts you off from doing things in the first place. So that's that.
And Tracy, given that the kind of Me Too movement epicenter in the U.S., do you think that American newsrooms are sufficiently dealing with sexual harassment as a journalist safety issue and potentially a press freedom issue?
I think things are definitely improving now. I think because of Me Too, it's being talked about, and people are being held accountable. I was, it wasn't at the very beginning of my career, but I remember going on we had to go out of town on a reporting trip. It was me and male colleague, and he, we were wanted to have a meeting before we had to go out. He invited me down to his hotel room. Probably not the smartest decision I made, but I was thinking about work, not anything else, until he opened the door and only a towel. And I just remember wanting to get the hell out of there. And I put a lot of that responsibility on me. I hope women now, today, know not to do that and to go to someone immediately. I did not go to our boss immediately, but a little while later, I learned that he had grabbed the breast of another woman. And my boss brought me into the office and asked if anything like that had happened with me, and I just burst into tears. And I recounted the time when he came to the door. I can think of another time I was a reporter starting a new job in Texas, and for some reason, all the women, the reporters who needed watching closely were moved to the desk where the Metro editors were. And of course, the Metro editors were 2 white men, but they were all moved to that desk. It was very demoralizing. Like you needed to be micromanaged, overseen, and so I was one of those reporters who was ultimately moved to the Metro desk. And one day, while I was sitting at the Metro desk, one of my female colleagues came in, and I just remember the Metro editor and the managing editor and a white male columnist making really derisive comments and looking at her derisively, and I was sitting right there. It was like I didn't even exist, and they were very, very comfortable. Nothing ever was done about that, but now I think as a result of some of the Me Too and Say Our Name movement, social media movements, that those things are changing, thankfully.
I wonder if that is, moving beyond the U.S. And Lina, as someone in charge of a newsroom, how are you ensuring that your staff are prepared and understand what, do you have a sexual harassment policy? How do you ensure that your staff are aware of it and feel free coming forward?
Yeah, I mean, I have to confess that I'm very disappointed at myself, even though I've been conscious that this should have happened a while back, ever since we started this quote-unquote progressive news media that is Mada Masr, that we haven't started off by doing a sexual harassment and sexual violence policy in general, not just sexual harassment. And it's, I think, a mistake that we're all facing in progressive organizations, that we think that because we are progressive, because we happen to be politically in a position that we think is the right position, not right with a big R, probably with a left with an L, but because we are in these organizations, we think that we are safe enough to not to have to worry about mounting a sexual violence policy. And I think what happened was the Me Too campaign, which also had a lot of resonance in Egypt, in Arabic, expressions online were made in Arabic using that very same hashtag and like linguistic appropriation of it, ana kaman, in Arabic, is that we also found stories coming out from progressive organizations about, people, women working in a leftist political party alongside other progressive men, or women working in a human rights organizations that is said to, report and advocate against the violations of the state. We started reading stories about how these women were subject not only to just sexual harassment, but even much more notorious forms of sexual violence that would go all the way down to rape. And it was an eye-opener. Of course, we engaged fiercely in the coverage of the story in the midst of a big controversy of, you know, we are all oppressed organizations, and politically we are all sharing that threat of the state cracking down on us. Do we bring each other's down by pointing to such institutional failures in protecting our communities and our staff members and so on? But it was quite clear that there was no question about needing to engage with this, because at the end of the day, we claim that we take a critical distance from everything and everyone, even if we are in solidarity with them politically, for example. But also what was an eye-opener in engaging with these incidents of sexual violence within progressive organizations, it became quite clear that the time has come for us to also develop our own policies. We are not intact, we are not great. Things can happen. Things can happen that are extremely invisible because we are, you know, operating in this, under this helm of being progressive, so the risk of invisibility can even be higher. And, you know, in a context of authoritarianism and ongoing political crackdown, it is, the narrative goes that, you know, you need to stay silent on these things because there is a bigger political threat that we need to be ready to defend ourselves against all the time. So it was very clear to me that there was no reason to, there's no reason to succumb to that, and, you know, we need to practice what it means to be progressive all the way by working on that. So in fact, the first thing I'm doing after going back home in a couple of days is going on a team retreat to discuss a draft sexual violence and other forms of violence policy that our HR team has put together. And, you know, our habit is to also engage with these policies collectively before they become final policies, and to try to apply it ASAP. So, and, you know, we can talk later about the different aspects of it, but an important aspect of it also that you know, took us some time to study and work on is, in cases of sexual assault, how do we bring justice? And what are different forms of alternative and community justice that we can think of in a context where we know there is no way we're going to go to the authorities or to the police and ask them for justice against perpetrators of sexual violence from amongst our ranks, basically. And that's a major learning experience. It's like, how do we think of justice beyond the criminal formal justice system? So
that's interesting, because one of the things that was happening in the US was this kind of, you know, vigilante form of justice, where these lists of men in the profession were going around. And, you know, I was in a discussion with a bunch of women photojournalists about, you know, first of all, very few, mainly freelancers, very few of them, first of all, knew what were the reporting mechanisms, you know, if they were working with a news organization to report sexual violence or sexual harassment. And also the idea that human resources departments are there to protect the company and not necessarily a freelancer. And then, you know, what was happening with these lists, and, you know, how to make sure that there was also justice there and communication. I'm going to open it up for questions, so I'm pretty sure there's a mic going around, so raise your hand while the mic comes to you. And I just want to ask Rosa if your news organization has a sexual harassment policy.
I can't answer this question. I don't know.
That's
what
interesting
yeah,
in and of itself.
I know, it's interesting, but I really don't have this information. Maybe we have a policy and I don't know. It can be. But so don't take this answer as anything. The 8th of March, we women journalists in Spain, we took a big step. We organized together to make a strike and to raise awareness of women issues in newsrooms. So I think this is a promising movement that we are starting, and it will come up with positive things. So this is what's happening in Spain.
Great. All right, we had a question here. Hopefully the mic got to you while I was talking. Okay, no, right here, right here.
Hi. Thanks for a very interesting panel, by the way. Lots of food for thought, and thanks for sharing your experience also. I'm a J-school professor, and the only female professor at my J-school, by the way. And I've been thinking a lot about different US2 sessions here at the festival and how to incorporate this in our curriculum. How do we teach female journalism students to be more aware of these issues, to be outspoken? Do you have any advice? What do we do in educational settings to sort of make them assertive, be aware, make them... I just need input.
If I may just address, I think one key is to reframe your question, because it's not just about what the female students should do, it's about what all of the journalism students need to learn. And I would say, first of all, approaching it from that perspective, I think we know at the Committee to Protect Journalists that very few journalism programs even address safety at all, not to mention sexualized violence, online harassment, digital safety, physical safety. There is a huge safety curriculum that really needs to be integrated into these programs. But Lina, I think it looks like you might have a thought.
Yeah, I mean, also at the risk of sounding too nerd, and while knowing that this is mostly about the more immediate questions of danger and risk management and safety and all that, but I was so worked up when you asked the question, because my main issue with my own experience with journalism school is that it also turns journalism into a very technical practice, and I feel like the major thing that needs to be fought for, which transcends the subject matter of this conversation here in this room, is to return journalism to the social sciences. And in the particular sense of gender, we need to think of how, again, to activate gender lenses in how we cover. And again, this is not just for female journalism students, but for everyone. People need to understand questions of gender intersectionality in order to also put the incidents they are into a more critical perspective, so that we can also think of more meaningful ways of responding to them.
Just to add on that, I think it's important to have that culture of accountability, kind of like Courtney was saying, because that in itself empowers female journalists to know that they have somewhere to land that will accept their experiences. And I just think you have to get the male students to be the allies. There has to be a joint approach. We have, yeah.
Thanks, Courtney. My name's Hannah Storm. I'm the director of the International News Safety Institute and one of Courtney's colleagues from a separate organisation. And we've got a panel later on sexual harassment as well. And I'm really pleased that there's a lot of conversations going on this year, because it does seem, as Tracy said, that there's been a bit of a sea change this year. I've just got two questions, if that's okay. Tracy, you mentioned that Facebook doesn't recognise that its terms of service are being abused. What suggestion would you have to Facebook in terms of being able to change that, is my first question. And my second question is, about 3-4 years ago, we did a research project with the International Women's Media Foundation that found that less than 1/5 of people who responded to the survey had reported incidents of sexual harassment. So less than 1 in 5 were actually prepared to come forward. So first of all, I'd like to say, all of your comments have been incredibly brave, so thank you. But how do we get over that? How do we try to encourage more women to come forward to, in a scenario where often they're punished rather than the perpetrators? Thanks.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. So your first question, excuse me, what would I do to get Facebook to change that? Well, I've been talking about it a lot. I've been interviewed by Daily Beast and Pointer and CJR, and I've been talking about what Facebook needs to do. I mean, I understand it's community standards and they rely on the community to hold bad actors to account, but they have to understand that good actors are being caught up in their you know, it's not benign. It's not all, their TOS is not all benign. Women are being silenced, people of color are being silenced because they are, you know, because of this kind of mob mentality, this mob violence, online violence against them. You know, Facebook is being called out a lot these days. This should be part of the conversation, and it's not. So I think once more of us start talking about this particular aspect, maybe, you know, that will change.
I will say that, so Facebook has the Facebook Safety Project, and CPJ is one of the partners, and we do talk to them about this and look for solutions. But I think there needs to be a lot more to be done, and it's very individual. So if you happen to know someone, you know, at an organization has those links, maybe you can get some help there. I think also, just to answer your question, you know, Facebook and these other social media platforms have things like super flagger status, and this is a whole other dimension, like for countering violent extremism or identifying hate speech, where these super flaggers can flag problematic content, and that gets put to the top of the list for human review. This is what they say. So it makes me wonder, couldn't you have capital so that if an account is regularly being reported as harassing, or an account is regularly posting content that violates the terms of service, it could be downgraded or something. I just wonder, like, is there not some sort of, you know, they're taking these algorithmic approaches to removing, you know, certain types of content, but don't seem to have applied it to the online harassment space. So So
let me push back a little bit. Facebook has the same problem that journalism has. No diversity. I mean, very little diversity. And so your human reviewers might as well not have any reviewers, because they have their biases too. And
Fair point.
Right, they're not.
Fair point.
They're just not. When it comes to, I mean, just talking about race is not racist. And that's what people, I mean, we're just writing and talking about issues about race and gender and sexuality. And the mere fact that we're writing and talking about that is not wrong, but it's being flagged as if it is. And that's how accounts get suspended. And so Facebook does not, its human reviewers don't always understand or recognize that. And you have to, the way to fix it, quite frankly, is to increase diversity among your ranks, just like journalists needs to do. I want to answer your other question about getting over it. So just this conversation has just a wave of things have just flooded back to me on all my experiences. We are, because Me Too has empowered women to say something, more women to say something about their fellow colleagues, that is changing. What I don't see changing a lot is accountability for people, for sources. I'm sitting here thinking, I remember interviewing a candidate for office and going to his office to interview him, and him locking the door and putting in a porn video. And nothing ever happened to this guy, nothing. And if that happened today, it might still be the same case. Nothing would really happen to him. I mean, we did have a pedophile run for office in the state of Alabama, and he almost made it. Almost made it into office. So I mean, while our colleagues are being held to some extent, being held accountable, those folks that we cover are still getting away with that. And so I think that we need to speak out more about that. We probably still, be on the receiving end of community wrath, but we should speak up.
Thank you, and point taken on the diversity. Did you want to add something? In the meantime, can you get a mic down to this woman?
Just want to add something very, very simple on the last question you made. I think we need to attract men to this conversation. I think we need men to be on this, and they are part of changing culture. Unless they don't change, we will have the same problem. I think there are a lot of men who are willing and who understand these issues and who are in, so we need to collaborate with them and to and make them feel part of this culture changing. Unless we don't integrate men on this conversation, we won't end the problem.
Agreed. Please.
Thank you. Sorry, my name is Solange. I'm from Rwanda. I work with Pax Press, a network of journalists. It's a local NGO. Just two comments, and I want to continue where she was, the last speaker. There is a need of making awareness on sexual harassment, because in some countries, hugging someone, give him a hug, like in Rwandan culture, is not a problem. But some colleagues abuse by saying, you want to stop us to hug, by saying that it's sexual harassment. So, because some, they don't catch well what is sexual harassment. Others, they know, but they want to go beyond. So there is a need of awareness, engaging men, HR, editors, directors, because mainly, especially in Rwanda, they are men, so that they can understand really what is sexual harassment. The second recommendation is to have a gender policy. In Rwanda, we are known as promoters of gender, yeah, but in the media is where in decision making we are under 4% of ladies at the management position. So this affects even the respect of gender, but there is no guidance in media houses. There is no guidance. If you have a good editor, if you have a good director, you can. He can be gender sensitive and understand those kind of things, but there is no guidance saying how gender is respected in newsroom, from the recruitment to the promotion to the content. There is no guidance. This is a fight we are trying to do with our NIFRA, World Association of Newspapers, so that the news media houses should have this guidance. So everyone, when he or she enters in the newsroom or in the media house, knowing how the gender and sexual harassment is a part of this gender policy, how gender is respected. Then a question, and I asked it even yesterday in other panels, I didn't get a response. Maybe we needed to think more about this, is to get proof, is to fight against impunity. And someone cannot be punished by law if there is no proof. In court, even in management meeting, if you want to report about sexual harassment, you have to provide proof. And sometimes you aggress verbally, you aggress physically, and you don't have a camera to record everything. And even, so to close there, so we need to think, and she was talking about our friend from Egypt, how to report, and to report, to have this safe, sure. Yeah, to be safe, that you will not lose your job, that you will not be labeled as a troublemaker. Yeah,
okay, thank you so much. I'm just, because we only have a couple more minutes, so who would like to address that?
I mean, I can say something very quick about, the real need to invest in forms of community justice that, are safe. How do we think of forming independent investigative committees? What are the different tools that these committees can do? The right of the survivor not to participate in the investigations and to just for the investigative committee to depend in their investigations on past incidents, is to have this awareness. And it's nothing that we need to invent from scratch. There are a lot of experiences that just need to be summoned, translated, and relocalized to our different contexts. So just an investment in that is very important, I think.
It's a little bit of a long shot, but it makes sense in my head, so let's see if it works. So yesterday at one of the US2 panels, there was a big discussion of PTSD and decreasing the stigma about PTSD among journalists. And that started happening when there were a lot of studies that came out, very reviewed academic studies, and then organizations started taking that seriously. And, you know, women have PTSD many, many more times than men do because of sexual violence. But as a woman, I don't feel, you know, represented in that conversation at this moment. So I do think if those two things could be integrated, at least in our field, that could go forward in terms of making some of these concrete policies happen in a way that, you know, it's, you know, we still obviously need more ways for proof, more ways for justice, the way that the court system works, but that is one way that more accountability can happen.
With that, I mean, that's kind of the perfect transition to conclude the panel. I mentioned in 2011, you know, the sexual assaults in Tahrir Square helped raise this issue, and CPJ did a report at that time called The Silencing Crime, Sexual Violence in Journalists. And we know that journalists stay quiet because of cultural and professional stigmas, and that only by reducing that silence will we help change that culture. And I think the Me Too moment is a moment in which silence is declining, right? We're hearing voices, we're hearing about it more. So I think we're all hoping that this is a sea change, that this is no longer a silencing crime, that people can come forward, but it's going to take a comprehensive approach to finding these solutions towards being able to report these abuses to our editors, to our colleagues, to authorities, having the, you know, both the corporate, you know, newsroom policies as well as the legal frameworks, and be able to deal with this across the digital and physical divide. So with that, I want to thank you here. I want to thank my panelists for their bravery in talking about experiences here, and for the organizers for putting this issue so prominently on the agenda here. So please join me in thanking these amazing women. Thank you, guys. Thank you.